So this talks on observability and getting insights and understanding into what your application is actually doing. Really quick, my name's Logan. I've been an engineer for over 10 years. Started as front end, moved to full stack, now do DevOps and platform. Everywhere from real estate to retail to like crafting, and most recently to healthcare and government work. I've lived in Pennsylvania for a little over a year now. I'm born and raised in Utah, spent about a decade in Salt Lake City. I like D&D, video games, traveling, cooking, baking is what I do in my off time. And this year, I'm trying to get, like most other people, into machine learning and AI. So really interested in a lot of like models and neurons and a bunch of stuff. But we're not going to talk about that today. So here's the agenda. I am going to try and not burn through this, but I'm going to try and get through a lot of the content because I actually find that the questions and the discussions. But I think the more important thing to take away from this is observability is really about understanding, right? So these things are great individually. What story does it tell collectively, right? When you're working in retail, does your application hold up under sales, right? Under spike traffic? If you're working under manufacturing, what does it look like when you have an increased order and you have to manufacture 10,000 of the same parts as opposed to your usual 1,000 a day or whatever, right? How does your application behave? I like this quote from the CTO of Grafana. He says, Tim Wilkie says, observability is not any one tool or technology. It is the practice of helping people understand the behavior of their applications and infrastructure. And so I'm really trying to get across, it's not about the raw data, it's about how the data is interpreted. So observability is like an onion, right? There's layers to it. At the base layer, you have your infrastructure, right? This could be cloud providers, data centers. It may just be a single on-prem server you have running in the corner of a closet. These are things like CPU. If you're running function as a service, invocation thresholds, it's network latency, it's application timeouts, it's all of that fun stuff. Next layer up, you have exceptions and errors, right? These are your 500 responses. These are your unhandled exceptions. These are your issues that may go unnoticed or result in downstream issues. And then there's logic and data errors. If you haven't already, you will, at some point in your career, receive a 200 OK response from something, and the message will say error occurred. That's a logic or a data error. Right? Similarly, 2 + 2 = 5, logic error, right? So it's those things that are a little bit harder to catch, but that's definitely part of it. Part of being able to observe and monitor your application, and part of being able to tell what it's doing. So why do we need to think about this? There's a lot of reasons, right? And I do this for a living and have for a while. I could talk about just this slide for a whole hour. But to give you the summary, the high level, when things go wrong, you want a quick way to know what's going on, and you want to be able to tell these are the circumstances under which this particular application went wrong. You need to define what's important versus what's nice to know. We're going to dig into that in a little bit. And then you want to know kind of what's happening to your end users, the people who are actually paying for the software, paying your company, paying your paycheck. It is incredibly important to understand what they're going through. So how do we do this? It's like, okay, we know that it's an understanding, we know that it's important. How do we actually do it? Okay. So it's as we saw with the quote earlier, it's more than a set of tools. It's a culture and a mindset, right? So start discussing with your teams, with your peers, what is important and what does your application need? What does your application do? And identify issues that could go wrong. And the first step is identifying the priority for those issues or for those needs. These are some example priority levels. Most incident management or ticketing systems has some sort of priority. This is how I define them. Right, so if you talk about P1 issue is critical, requires immediate action, it's customer impacting, complete service degradation, Most companies associate it with a loss of revenue. So if you're running an e-com site and your database crashes, that is a P1. You need to get on that right now because you can't do anything without it, right? P2 is service degradation. It requires immediate attention. It's very specific to either provider's data stream, or it's specific to like certain symptoms of like a bigger critical issue. Let's say you have a multi-server fleet and like 3 or 4 of them start going offline. It's like, okay, but the application's still running. It doesn't seem like it's crashing immediately, but that's still pretty important to know, right? Or a P3, which is production event that could lead to bad data, could snowball, could lead to increased costs. These are things like, hey, our CPU spiked a couple hours ago and it's been holding at that higher level. And we're not seeing any other issues, but like that's still something to keep an eye on. These are obviously a starter place. The different priority levels is to be determined by you and your team who know the application the best. Dashboards are cool, alerts are better. Dashboards look really cool on big screens like this, or like if you have a wall of like LCD monitors, right, or TVs, that you just want to look cool and feel like you're in like a space command center. Awesome, dashboards are cool. Realistically, we're not going to spend our days just staring at a dashboard, right? Alerts are better because they're proactive and they can alert you to something happening without you having to watch it. But you shouldn't be alerting on everything. And people seem to get really excited with their monitors and their alerts. If any of you are familiar with the term alert fatigue, or at least the concept of it, by raise of hand, how many of your guys' inbox or text messages have just been inundated by alerts that you're like, ignore, 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 ignore? Yeah, all right, that's like a good 90% of you. Yeah, alerts should be like the exception to the rule. And if something is like, if you need to know something but not alert on it, log it, right? And then actually look at your logs. That's the important part. I did have someone say, oh, I never look at my logs. Look at your logs, please. Okay, so what tools are available to me? This is an open source conference, right? Everyone's interested in free stuff. There are many open source tools you use. Nagios, Prometheus, Grafana are very popular. I have a lot of extensive experience with Grafana. You can do some cool stuff in there. If you are looking for a commercial solution, right, Datadog's probably #1. Stackify, SolarWinds, New Relic is like used to be like the name probably like 10-ish years ago. But if you don't have access to those tools, you don't want to pay for them, you don't want to install and manage them, that's fine. If you're working with a cloud service provider, you have them already, right? AWS CloudWatch, Google Cloud Operations, Azure Monitor, like there are ways to get the information that we talked about, right? Those metrics, logs, and metrics, logs, and traces. Excuse me. The most important thing, it doesn't. Okay, I'm going to say something a little controversial, and most salespeople would immediately disagree with me. It doesn't matter which tool you use, but just get really good at it, right? If you're going to pay for something like Datadog or spend the time managing a self-hosted Grafana instance, like get really good at it so that you can get really efficient and you can identify and alert on the right things. I am also assuming, based on my previous response, that a lot of you have dealt with a complex system or paid for maybe an expensive service and have just scratched the surface of it. And then someone is like, why are we paying for this when it can do 100 other things? Master it. I cannot emphasize that enough. Oh yeah, but this last statement's kind of a reminder to me too. Again, remember, only track what's important. Master the tool, but you don't use it to track everything. Unless you have a filter on your inbox that says, skip the inbox, go to trash. Okay, so when do I start thinking about this, right? When do I start thinking about observability? A lot of people are like, oh, when it hits production. No. If you were thinking about observability by the time it hits production, it's too late. You want to think about it while designing, right? While coding, while thinking about, okay, if this thing happens and this function or this error happens, how am I going to detect that on the outside? Most SDLCs or security requirements lock a good majority of developers out of a production environment. So you need to know how are you going to monitor your application from a distance, right? I've seen a great benefit from lecturing my product managers over and over about the importance of observability, because once it starts making its way into product requirements, everyone's life gets so much easier. So a couple questions to think about kind of as you're designing or as you're coding, right? How can we ensure the application's operating as intended from a distance, right? You want to leave it alone, send it out into the world, and make sure that it's actually doing what it's supposed to. And then think, if something does go wrong, how will we triage? And I want to make a small correction to myself. It's not if something, it's when something goes wrong, right? If you put something out in the world, it's gonna break. I don't care who you are. You can write a simple function that says, print hello world. It's gonna break at some point, right? It's gonna be some dumb package dependency. Okay. When do I decide to alert, right? We talked about only alert on the important things that require attention, but what does that mean? Typically, if something warrants a monitor, warrants something to warrants something to be watched, it warrants an alert. Otherwise, it should be on some aggregation, it should be on some dashboard, it should be something that you can look at periodically and do a trend analysis on, right? Where you alert should depend on the priority of the issue. Is it an email? Is it to a Slack channel? Is it to your team's private Slack channel, right? Is it a call at 3 a.m. in the morning? That's the other thing. It's like, if you're writing a monitor and you're like, I don't need to be woken up at 3 a.m. in the morning for this, it's not a key one. That's just good rule of thumb. Don't. And then you alert appropriately depending on the severity of the alert. This is also important to call out. If something does not need to be acted on immediately, like it can wait until business hours or it can wait until the next sprint, it's not an alert. Again, when do I not alert? It's a few important questions, right? In addition to, do I want to be woken up at 3 a.m.? The next step down is, do I want to be in the zone and interrupted and pulled out of that flow in order to address this issue? Is it going to be remedied automatically, or does it require manual action? One of my developers on my team once put an alert on when the instance is in a load balancer, when the CPU capped out. And I was really annoyed by that because the load balancer just cycles it out automatically. So I'm like, just give it 30 seconds and it's gonna go away. Don't send me an email about it, that's annoying. And then this last question is particularly important in keeping around the mentality of understanding and getting insights. If the alert does not actually tell you what's going on, or it is not indicative of what's going on, it's just a fun thing you want to be alerted on, you don't want to be alerted on it, right? I don't care if I've sent out 1,000 emails for the day or 2,000 emails a day, right? I care about, are we hitting rate limits and are we failing before sending the email out, right? I build a dashboard. Okay, when I do decide to alert, how do I avoid fatigue? If it hasn't been clear already, you don't want to over alert on things. You can tell that I feel very strongly about a couple things. All right, if everything is important, nothing is, right? I'm gonna skim through this because we've talked this to death. I do want to highlight this last section of evaluate your alerts on a regular basis. And this is something that is not, that people kind of get tripped up on because they think, okay, my application is out in production, I can set it and forget it. No, right? Your application evolves over time, right? The surrounding environment, either the cloud provider or data center, or even how users interact with it, evolves over time. Your observability should too. All of your alerts should reflect on that. I don't want to be alerted on a function that was written 4 years ago that hasn't ran in the last 36 months. And I don't want that alert to say, this hasn't ran in a long time. I know. That's intentional. Anyway. Okay, let's talk about Observability 2.0. I may be a little bit late to the game around this whole OLLI abbreviation, so I'm going to explain it to you so that you can have the same, like, oh, light bulb moment I did. It's O, and then the 11 letters between O and Y, and then Y, all of observability. It's amazing. I had seen it, and I knew what it meant, but I didn't know why it meant that. Anyway. This has been a very recent term that has come up. I would say it's definitely getting traction. It's showed up around, you know, the rise of ChatGPT and a lot of LLMs and this AI wave that everyone's riding. OLLI 2.0, it's building on the foundation of metrics, logs, and traces, and taking it a step further, right? So it's providing context to your data. It's using smart alerts for, like, hey, this is off trend. It's not necessarily, this is above threshold, but it's like, this is not normal. It's not proactive, or it's not just proactive monitoring. It's getting information back to the product teams. It's understanding the problems your users are running into and integrating those into your development process. What does that even mean? It's a lot of words. Great, a lot of, like, marketing fluff. So when I say providing context in an observability sense, right, you want to use your system metrics and, like, understanding of your application to drive your KPIs and OKRs. Those are fancy acronyms for, like, team goals. If your business wants to drive conversions, for example, I know a couple of you mentioned retail, or even just, like, contact forms. Page performance and error rate are a key indicator of those user experiences. You want to be able to tell if someone across the country who you don't know is able to load the page that they're supposed to. If your user can't make it to their cart, can't make it to the contact page, can't make it to where they're going, it's a missed opportunity. And you should know that without someone bringing their laptop over to you saying, hey, the page isn't loading. You should be able to know. And then you should be able to build a narrative around that. And this one's kind of a fun thing to think about, because if I were, let's say I'm a new manager, right, new director, whatever, where it's like semi-technical, and I come to you and I say, I want you to walk me through how when someone makes an API request, how does it trace all the way through our system, and how do you respond to it? How clearly can you tell me it goes through steps 1, 2, 3 for these functions, and here's the evidence to support it, right? Whether that be log functions, whether that be like traces, or maybe there's like database checkpoints. Can you pick out a single request and can you trace it all the way through? How would you explain the process of an OAuth handshake with supporting system metrics to do it? Now, I think there may be some of you who could tell me conceptually, oh yeah, this is an OAuth handshake, this is how you do, like, single sign-on or SAML authentication or whatever. How many of you can show me and say, like, hey, this is how many requests this endpoint has, or how many times it's been invoked. This is the users and the request count we're seeing on our SSO platform, like Okta or Google Workspace or whatever. And then this is how many active sessions we're seeing. So you kind of start to see how those metrics and how those system information can start building a narrative of, like, this is what our user experience is, and you can use that to then identify what's important. We're going to get into more of that in just a minute. This is something I threw in last night because it occurred to me that a lot of people may think about observability or production support at like a UI or a web server level. And I would like to very much emphasize that is not the case. Understanding your data is just as important as understanding your system. So if you're working on machine learning models, right, are you tracking the loss over time as you guys are updating the model, or as you're getting new training data? How many errors are occurring in your data ingestion pipeline? Or your data streams, right? If you are doing an MMORPG, a video game, and you are having data stream through a WebSocket, Do you understand how that data is being sent to you? Do you understand how your application is handling that data, whether it's a kind of large influx or if it's just a one-off update? How did your users even know if they were getting was correct? How many times have you guys seen an update in your application or seen something get out and you're like, wow, that really wasn't supposed to happen. And your QA team was like, oh, I didn't know that wasn't supposed to happen. It looked great to me. If your QA team will do that, that's a huge red flag. But your users even more so aren't going to know, right? They're not going to know that product name is wrong. They're just going to see what they see and assume that it's correct. So the question becomes, how can you ensure that they're seeing the right information? Do you have automated UI tests? Do you have some sort of production test that's hitting the search index, looking at certain values, right? How can you ensure that what they're seeing is correct? Again, this is going back to those data and logic errors we talked about earlier. Okay, so we're going to talk about an example scenario. I'm going to pause. Any questions so far before we get into examples? Cool. All right. How are they going to? Oh yeah, we're doing so good. We have an application. There's an e-commerce site with caching and search. There's a very small-ish system architecture that's going to get blown up here in a minute. It's on AWS. There's various things like a database, like a Redis cluster, Elasticsearch, and some topics and queues. So, given the system architecture, right, what are the 3 most important metrics to watch in this architecture? What are things that you wouldn't want to alert on, but would be important to review on a regular basis? And how do you determine those? Here's all the possible metrics, well, not all of them. A large portion of the possible metrics report on with these 7 components. It is about 30, in case you're wondering. All right, so let's take a closer look. First question should be, if we're looking in terms of P1 alerts or things that we have to monitor, what is absolutely required to run this application? The next question is, what is used to increase performance but have fallback methods? Like, what is somewhere between required and nice to have, right? Of like, oh, hey, this makes a big impact, but technically speaking, we don't have to have it. And what are some things that you can operate without? Similarly, what metrics may seem important, but if you put it into the context of the application, are actually not important. So, the load balancer, the EC2 instances, and the database are required to run this application. You have to have web servers, you have to have a database. With those 2 things, you have an e-com site. Right? Redis and Elasticsearch help the application be more performant, but have fallback methods. If you have a cache miss or like something's missing in your search index, it just falls back to the database. Right? Analytics, topic, and queue are useful to marketing and sales, but functionality are not required. Right? Like I don't need a stream of click data to make sales. Some marketers would disagree with that. They're wrong. Okay. So then we highlight those and we say, okay, the topic's not required. These 2 things are kind of nice to have. These 3 things are like critical. Entry point, web server, database. Right? Okay. So coming back to our questions, hold on, way too many animations on that slide. What's absolutely required to run our application? We've identified that. What's used to increase performance? Fallback methods, cache and search. What's something you could operate without? Analytics information, bloatware, and what metrics may seem important, but when put in the context of the whole application isn't. Let's see here. Do I have? Oh no, I don't. Sorry. That's fine. Okay, so in that case, I would think put an alert on the database, right? If the database goes down, if it stops responding, if the CPU gets higher than say 60%. Like, I want to know about it, and I want to know about it fast. If this is an auto-scaling group, I don't necessarily need to know the individual server CPU, right? If I've got a fleet of 20 servers and Amazon is handling that like horizontal scaling for me, I don't care about an individual. I do care, however, about the collective, right? If I have 20 servers and all of the CPU spikes, go up to 100 and things are getting rotated out and the CPU is still spiking, that I do care about, right? That could be indicative of malicious attack, could be indicative of bad code, bad deployment, it could be indicative of a lot of things, right? So that is like critical. Similarly with our application load balancer, right? I want to know if the load balancer is returning 200 calls. Actually, let me rephrase that. I want to know if it's not returning 200 calls. Right? I don't care. If you serve 10,200 calls, great, you're doing your job. Don't talk to me. But if you're serving 5,500 errors, different story. So put an alert there and make sure like, okay, users are getting 200 calls, my servers are responding and are performing the way they should be, nothing is like getting out of hand, and the database is still up. Cool, I have a site, people are buying things, people are making money. Awesome. As far as my cache and my search service, I might care about cache misses if it's a trend over a day, right? If it is consistently 80% cache miss for, I would say, more than a day, that's important to know, versus if I just launched a new product and it's 80% cache misses for like 10 minutes, different contexts, right? So it's not that I would want to alert on cache misses altogether, so much as does it fit the context of the application? And then similarly, I actually don't need any alerts on the topics and the queues. Maybe if it's 0 for an extended period of time, nothing is getting through there, I could alert on that, but it would be like a Slack FYI this is happening. That's not a page at 3 a.m. Now, taking a look, taking with a Ollie 2.0 lens, right? We talk about context and narrative. What are some things we can do to be proactive? How can we avoid incidents before they happen? And how can we contextualize the information given back to us? So proactive, I can scale up before big holiday sales, right? Black Friday, almost everyone's shopping online these days. So I need to scale way up, probably a couple days beforehand, to handle that holiday sale without interruption. I want to pre-warm cache. No one should be doing full cache flushes realistically anytime during the day, but especially not during high sale times, right? Don't get rid of the whole reason it's there. I want to add a reader node to my database, right? I want multiple replicas going on so it can handle the read traffic. And then if I need to do any sort of re-indexing or I need to update product information, ideally it should be done during low traffic times to where that index can be updated and there not be adverse effects from having a huge influx of traffic. Right? Now, these are all things you can do to be proactive. You can also do these things once you start seeing signs of your system being stressed, do all of these same things. But the point is to think about it ahead of time and to do it before you need to, right? Okay, so how can we contextualize the information given back to us? If I were to have, let's say, Google Analytics, again, this is our e-com site, right? Right, if Google Analytics tell me you have 1,000 active users on the site for over, let's say, an hour. I can then look at the response time from the load balancers and from the EC2 instances to be able to say, this is how fast pages are processing, right? Similarly, I can query the database, or I can even just look at database query stats and say, this is how much activity is happening. And you can almost tell the story of saying, hey, these response times are super low. When they were low, we were actually receiving a high number of orders. And then you'll see someone went and updated something that needed to update the cache and the index and the database. and response times went up for a little bit. You'll actually notice orders dipped, kind of, because it might have been taking longer for them to get to their cart or to their checkout page or whatever, right? And then suddenly all your business stakeholders are listening because they're like, oh, you've had a tech backlog item for performance improvements that we put to the side for new features. I'm now understanding why that's important. So it's a nice way to be able to say like, hey, this is what's going on with our system, why these things are important, and here's how it's affecting the business. Not just that, but you can also go back and say, hey, so you know how you got super frustrated and almost threw your phone across the room because Amazon was loading way too slow on their on this specific product variation? It's like, yeah, we don't have that, and here's the proof, right? How many of you have had some senior leadership person come up and say, well, my kid was experiencing this issue and the page took forever to load, and so we need to, that's the new number one priority. And am I the only person in there? Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's a weird conversation to have, right? Because you can go back and say, actually, you're in the 90th percentile, that doesn't usually happen. Your Wi-Fi was probably garbage. Anyway, it's a fun conversation. I hope those of you who haven't had it don't get to. Okay, so with that, I'm going to leave you with a question. And we've only used 30 minutes of our hour, so I want to turn this into a little bit of a discussion. How well do you understand your service? And I was asking some of you earlier about kind of the industry and the area that you worked in because context matters. And I'd love to hear either some use cases or I'd love to hear some challenges that maybe you guys are facing in terms of either production support or observability, or really just kind of gaining insights and either see if we can address those or brainstorm some things and contextualize that information for yourself, other developers, and the business. Is there anything anyone would like to share before I continue to throw out examples that I've had to deal with? Yeah.
I have a question. You're talking about like Ollie 2.0 and like comparing trends. Have you found any particular tools that are good at like comparing and monitoring trends? That always seems kind of like the role of like the guy sitting at the knob.
Right. A lot of observability tools. So the question for those who couldn't hear was, are there any good tools for like monitoring trends, right? There's not a lot. There's obviously coming out more. So like Datadog has an anomaly alert that'll do that same thing. I think in a recent update, Grafana might have it as well. But you have to have a certain amount of historical data for it.
Yeah.
But it's essentially a really simple like machine learning model that says, okay, here's the time frame, here's the percentage. Okay, now apply this to, alert whenever it's outside of this trend. In terms of like what blog or what article or source, whatever, can I go to get referrals? There's not a great one. You just kind of have to do your own research to figure out what tool best fits you.
Sweet.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Kind of curious what people do for, it's not in telemetry specifically, it has always been kind of hit or miss for me. It can get very noisy, you can get alerts for stuff, you get a lot of false positives, like it's just a very, something I've always fought, and I feel like I put a lot of effort into, and like, I mean, I've gotten much better over the years, but I just wonder like what's, kind of what people are doing in that area, or if you have any experience, or just kind of like what is any.
Yeah, I do, but I actually want to turn it, anyone have experience with front-end telemetry before I answer that question? Okay, you're talking about like
browsers.
Yeah. So there's a couple things that I've done. A lot of it is server responses to particular assets or like API calls. But if you're talking about like how do you get the telemetry of like your React or Angular app of like I want to trace this through the call stack. I haven't personally found a great way to do that other than export the, it's not an XHR file,
Heart.
Hard file, thank you, yeah. Other than exporting that and then kind of breaking that apart. And then if you're able to take the har file and then look at the long running calls, right, or long running requests, and if you're able to link them to either your backend or to a specific function, then you can dig in deeper. You can say like, okay, well, what metrics and what information do I have available of that particular resource? Or in, let's say, load testing, right, what's my memory consumption of that particular function? So that was a very long way to say I don't have a great answer for that.
Yeah, it's definitely a frustrating thing. I know, like, one thing I lean on a lot that is like event trails. So if you see an error, kind of seeing what steps the user took to get there is one way that I've kind of. It's just a lot of times you get back minified code. Like it's just I feel like the front end is probably one of the weakest areas served by observability right now.
It is. It's also hard, and this kind of applies for all of observability, but especially front end of. There's a privacy aspect there as well, because like you don't want to put a function that's like, hey, track this har file on a client's computer and then like SFTP it back to our server. That's sketchy. So it's definitely one of those things that's harder to do. I've had decent luck with, I think they're called tracer functions. That's basically at a certain point in the application or at a certain point, certain action, sending a little analytics request, basically, to a backend or to an analytics service that then you can analyze. So when I worked in ecom, we used Google Tag Manager's window layer. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Sorry?
Data layer.
Data layer, thank you. And so we would track information about a user's cart and say like, hey, they added this product when it was at this quantity. They went from this page to this page. This is like the shipping method that they chose. And so using GTM's data layer, we were able to like extract that information, but it just comes back to what it is you're trying to track. And that one's nice because that has the added buffer of like Google does all the anonymization for you, so you don't have to worry about it. Yeah.
I don't know if you do anything with native apps on mobile applications. Do you have any solutions for tracking metrics on those?
I haven't, but someone else in here has got to. Observability on mobile native apps. Yeah.
Use Bundstack.
What is that?
Bundstack.
I don't personally use it, but my team uses Adobe Analytics Mobile.
This is great.
We were using Visual Studio App Center, but we just got the notification that's going away here. So.
I think my last company used Firebase too. Sorry, I don't have a better answer. So question for you guys. Let's say I work at a data analytics company, right? And my team is specifically responsible for our data ingestion pipeline, where it's basically like someone is going to drop off files to a, let's call it an SFTP server, and I'm supposed to have some sort of function that picks up those files and processes those data to like, ship it down the pipeline, but also what information could I then extract for me to be able to like action on if something went wrong, right? From an observability standpoint, if you're looking at a data ingestion pipeline, what are your critical areas of monitoring?
In my experience working with files, they're ubiquitous and often garbage. So schema or some structured way to talk about the contents and even the name of the file, so maybe the metadata. I feel like that's something, just maybe speaking from personal pain, like I have a lot of feelings about this. So let's capture the file and the schema and the metadata.
Okay. I saw it. Yeah.
So beyond that on this main point, the big one is statistical trends on the daily load. Like
And for the group, what does that tell you?
That tells me if there's something upstream from me that's not behaving properly, or if there's some sort of new change fundamentally in a source, then now I need to spin data science around understanding the source change.
And I will add one more to that. If you're able to keep track of statistical changes over time, you're also able to determine how effective your changes are when they get deployed. So it's useful to know if something upstream is changing, but also like if you have a new release, and I don't know what your use case is, it may be specific to a specific use case, but for me, it's always been useful to be able to say like, hey, this change resulted in positive trends, right, in terms of like less processing power or quicker turnaround time, or it could have blown it way out of the water. Great example of that is when we went international with the e-com site I was working on, we released an update to launch support for the British pound, and our product indexing took 10 times longer. And it took us a minute to figure that out. But because we were watching index times and database loads, we did catch it. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'd say something that people always think about like stack traces, all that kind of stuff, but from your CI/deployment process, like deploy markers. It's kind of it's about what you're alluding to there essentially, but yeah, just purposely uploading deploy markers is super helpful to know like you see the marker and you see the graph went up or down right in your graph, so it's kind of it helps. You can usually get back from there to the specific commit or request to review the code that change.
Deploy markers in your CI/CD pipeline for those who maybe couldn't hear. Another thing that may seem obvious, but the obvious things always get you, is if you just don't receive any files at all, right, in a data pipeline. It's like, that may be indicative of something, especially if you're supposed to be doing real-time like collection and analysis. Something may have changed. Some network admin might have gone from allow to deny on a port range that you needed, and then suddenly you're not collecting anything, right? So it's not always a hard case. In fact, you should cover your obvious ones at first and just get those out of the way, and then you can pile on each one. All right, so another use case, let's say I'm working in events, right? I think it was Eventbrite is what this event was managed through. If you're working on Eventbrite services, what are some metrics you might trace to find user experience? Right. If I'm a developer at Eventbrite and I want to ensure that users are booking their events right successfully and they're having a good experience, what kind of data would you collect for that?
Time from first interaction to purchase, maybe?
Yep. Conversion time, that's a good one. So I feel bad. I feel like I should have warned you guys there was going to be a quiz at the end. Anything else?
Potentially email services, so making sure that those tickets are actually being delivered through mail.
Yep. Confirm delivery receipt.
You track page logs, see if you want to go back and forth a couple times.
Ooh, check out flow. That's a good one. GTM data layer, great for that. They do all the analytics for you. Anything else? Yeah.
Did they actually go to the event?
Did they actually? Oh, I like that attendance. I didn't consider that one.
Along the somebody else got one.
Car abandonment.
Card management.
I was just gonna say, along with email, I know one that's been a team I work closely with recently is observing if like the primary call to action in the link was actually like what the open rate is for that, because like deliverability looked fine, but it doesn't tell you whether it's delivered to their spam or like a regular inbox. So that was something like that we, if we would have been proactively kind of watching like how many people are actually getting the email plus like are actually actioning the email, so we had some better trends to help determine that was going to spam.
Yeah. For those of you who work on the front end in UI, there are actually services that will run automated UI tests periodically. You can specify if you want it in like a staging or production environment, and you can define the like user flow, and it'll essentially emulate a browser, and it'll go through and like find the specific elements, and it'll run that test every so often. And I know there are some for mobile apps too that'll load the app and emulate a device, and we'll go through certain flows. But I also, hearing myself, I understand we're bridging into QA automation, but it's they can be very useful, right, to kind of ensure that your users are seeing what they're supposed to be seeing. We have an automated test run every 10 minutes, I think, on an add to cart button, because if something went wrong with that product went out of stock, like we knew people were going to be unhappy. And so it was like, it was nice to have that check and that alert. Not to my team, because I didn't care, but the marketing team. Sorry, I do care. I care about the success of the business, but like as an engineer, I don't care if a product's out of stock. That's my marketing team's problem. Yeah.
You definitely want to check status, like success rates on creating events and on like buying tickets for events. And I'm kind of offering that perspective with a question too. Do you have any perspective on cardinality? I was thinking, like you said, your e-com platform went international. Like I can imagine collecting the geography of events that were successfully created versus like unsuccessfully created. Maybe like for some reason the country code bombs out, you know, if
Right.
people are creating events in France. But like the more you get into that observability system, the more expensive it can get.
Right.
Yeah.
So the question was cardinality of tests in an observability system. How many like permutations should you account for, right, in your system? I would say when it comes to observability and UI and user experience, it should be like your critical path of whatever is most important. And if you have 2 or 3 deviations of that, so like going back to the previous example, like you mentioned, for an e-com site, maybe I have a US-based customer and I have a UK-based customer. What's the critical path for those 2, and does that work, right? Similarly, some APIs are versioned, some of them have like a language code in the path. That's another one where it's like, okay, we're tracking these metrics in V1, but because of the changes we made in V2, those are kind of irrelevant. So we're not going to monitor those in V2. But V1's still in production, so we still have to support it, right? To your point, it can get expensive. It can also become very, overbearing is not quite the word I want to use. It's really, really high cognitive load if you're tracking 10 different like test cases, right? It goes back to how much information do you need to very quickly assess what is going on, right? I shouldn't have to dig through 10 test cases or test results, or even 10 different metrics, right? To be able to say like, hey, this is what's going on, and this caused this, da 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 da. I should be able to say like, okay, this alert went off, then this alert went off 2 minutes ago, based on that and the logs at the time, like this is what happened. Also, I know we talked a lot about what not to alert on, avoiding alert fatigue. Same thing goes for log bloat. Don't log everything. That's a trap that a lot of people fall into, because it's so easy to be like, logger.info, reached here, but it's, in a production sense, it just creates a lot of noise. Right? Whatever noise you do create has to be very meaningful.
Just one quick note on that. Please don't find yourself not logging things that the security policy procedures will require, because it upsets your security guy and find out, what do you mean we're not logging logins anymore? The auditors are going to be here tomorrow.
Remember, the noise should be important, and security compliance is important to most people. Yeah.
I'm curious what people's definitions of PII is. Like, I work in healthcare, so we tend to be pretty tight on all the daily work with this system. So, curious if people like, is an email looking at log, like the login ID, that okay to put in your log?
Short answer is no. Longer answer, does anyone have the like textbook definition of PII?
Personally identifying
You
information.
can get it off HHS is what I get.
You can't get it off HHS, you were correct. PII is personally identifiable information, but there is a definition that includes, here are the things that quantify. That's basically anything linked to an individual's identity, and I can't remember how recent it was, but it did get expanded to email addresses.
You said it did, right?
It did, yes.
Yeah,
So
that was my understanding as well.
yeah, so PII includes like obviously your name, birthday, social, all that stuff, but it also includes your email address, really I think any email address, and some sites are considering like a user name or user ID to be PII as well. If you have just a numeric user ID, that's not PII because you can't point and say, oh, it's that person. But like my username is @Logan Farr. That's pretty identifiable, right? So
It's interesting when you get requests from managers for observability purposes that don't quite align with those definitions.
And going back to the call out of logging security events, also be very wary of PII in your security events. Yes, you need to log, when the user logs in. Don't tell me their email address. Yeah.
So for the PII stuff, we do a lot of work in Europe as well, so we have the GDPR, so we just say whatever the lawyers tell us is PII.
Which is a very valid answer.
So, going beyond the PII, getting an understanding of differential privacy and how to apply that can really change some of your dynamics around what you actually consider protected or not. Doesn't necessarily help the observability space, but if you're doing long-term data storage of information, you don't want to be able to reverse it, that's one of your key paths. It's tricky to get teams to take differential privacy on, but you can decide it to place it.
Yeah.
Given that conversation, how would you recommend actually being able to trace what happened with something, right? So now I've got everything set up, right? And I see something went wrong, okay? I have an allergic reaction personally to publicly exposing database primary key from my microservice, right? That's it, I just did it there. Well, how do I then say, okay, right, this is the service that's actually handling login, something blew up in the middle of it. Well, how do I know who was affected and what went through if I don't have that information there? So.
Yes, fantastic question. I also love the term allergic reaction. That was awesome. So the question was how do you keep privacy while still being able to trace through a certain event that resulted in an error? So yeah. There's a few different ways you can do it. So if you want to specify this specific user was impacted, numeric or random generated IDs are best, right? So if you have a UUID for a user in your database, use that and reference that UUID in request headers, right? Or in some way that you can then correlate that to a request path. Similarly, you can use UUIDs or GUIDs, whatever you want to call them, just at request start, right? So Amazon has, when you fire up a Lambda function, it'll automatically generate a request ID, and then you can use that to pull out all of the logs specific to that request. Similarly, if you're working in distributed systems, you can generate a request ID or a correlation ID as part of either middleware or as part of constructing that request so that you can then do that. There is no inherent way to track a request through a distributed system without being very conscious of it, right? You may think that tools can very smartly say, hey, these things happen right after each other sequentially. When you're working with distributed systems, none of that is guaranteed. In fact, I would say when you work on consolidated systems, it's barely guaranteed, right? So just be conscious about it, design for it ahead of time. And put those little markers, put those user IDs, those tenant IDs, those whatever, something that is randomly generated by a machine that you can then use to pick out what happened. Does that answer your question? Great. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
So I know this probably will vary based on team size and company life cycle, what early stage startup or more enterprise. How do you figure out how to spend percentage of the dev team's time on observability versus, excuse me, building new things?
I have a rule of thumb, but that's a very subjective question. Does anyone else want to jump in before I answer that question? So the question was, how much time should engineers be doing things like observability and production support versus building new stuff?
For us, it largely comes down to my manager, who's like very dialed into the technical performance, and he has a lot of dashboards and Splunk. So a lot of times we'll ask for specific measures that we have to support.
As a manager, I love that answer. It says, it's up to my manager. No. It depends, and it's so hard. I'm gonna put like issue triage and production support. I'm gonna put that aside for a minute, right? If stuff's on fire, obviously attend to that. If it's sort of like monitoring and observability features, it should be anywhere from 10 to 20% in my head, because that percentage is just enough for you to like have space to think about it and to be able to say like, go through all these questions and these exercises of like, what's most important? But it's not enough that like, you're only building observability, right? Because if you're only doing that, you don't have time for features, which is what everyone actually wants to do. Similarly, there's a project management course I took a while ago, and there was like a diamond shape, and the top little portion of it was production support. The big middle section was ongoing operations, and then the bottom part of it was like POCs, side projects. It's the experimental stuff, right? And so I like to think of that kind of balance of like, hey, operations, observability, all that stuff does come first, but it doesn't come for very long. And then we move on to like, we're gonna actually do what we're paid to do, which is build features and bring value. But they don't have any value if they're broken. All right, a couple more.
I have one kind of a take on that. So you asked how much time you spend like adding observability stuff. I think that it should kind of happen as you're developer. Like so for metrics and logs, I'm not just going to write my code, ship it, and then hope my manager, whoever project manager, gives me a ticket to add observability later. I kind of need to know like, hey, if this fails here, I should probably log that for me. So I think that or like, hey, every time this thing triggers as an interesting metric, let's ship that off, and then later if I want to see how many times was this function called, if it was only called one, okay, failed experiment, delete it. So I think that kind of happens like while you're developing. If you're making the new features, you want to be thinking about observability and metrics then. Obviously alerts come later, but yeah, I think it's kind of today, Mondays I work on observability, and then Thursday through Friday I work on, or Tuesday through Friday I work on new features.
Well, it goes back to like putting that into the product requirements and like doing it in the design phase. I think we are about out of time, so let me leave you with this. I want to give you all a challenge. When you guys go back to work on Monday, or Tuesday, take Monday off, right? Whenever you guys go back to work, go look at whatever monitoring system you have. Be it Grafana, Datadog, whatever. If there's a dashboard your team has built, great. If there's an alerts channel in Slack that you guys have integrated, fantastic. Go look at it and then ask yourself, what does this actually tell me? That's it. Thanks for coming to my talk.